Hi everybody, welcome to IndyCar on the 6th of August 2019. Well, what a difference a day makes. There's an awful lot of things happening all at once at the moment. Let's look at the most, well, I would think the two most important things at the moment that are newsworthy as far as Scotland is concerned. And one is the prospect that there might be time for a general election just before Brexit. Now the timescale to do this is amazingly tight. We're talking about maybe 4 or 5 days of breathing space between the possibility of having a general election at the earliest possible time and the Brexit date of the 31st of October. In order for there to be a general election, first of all, as soon as Parliament is recalled on the first day back, there would have to be a motion of no confidence in the government tabled by enough MPs to force a vote. And it would take a good number of MPs in the Tory ranks to vote against their own government to force Boris Johnson basically to hold a general election against his will. He's already indicated that he doesn't want to hold a general election before Brexit, but Dominic Cummings, who appears to be speaking for Boris as well, was saying that if there were to be any general election, it would not happen until after Brexit had already happened. Now this this whole situation is right down to the wire at the moment, and I noticed that Michael Gove was quoted in the media this morning as saying that it appears that the European Union doesn't want to talk to the UK. Now this is rather the disingenuous way of putting it, because the European Union has done nothing but talk to the United Kingdom for the last 3 years nearly about Brexit. It thought it had a deal arranged. The deal was signed by the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, and it was ready to be put to the Parliament of the United Kingdom, and it was rejected 3 times. Now, ostensibly, the Tory government has said that they rejected it because of the Irish backstop, and that this was somehow politically unacceptable to them. When in actual fact they had, well, Theresa May had signed the agreement saying that Britain would keep all of Northern Ireland's restrictions and laws and trade regulations broadly in line with those of Europe if there was no deal after Brexit had occurred. In other words, if we left the European Union and couldn't come to a trading agreement, that the UK had committed itself to keeping an open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic and not building any infrastructure, and that was part of the deal. That was all the backstop was. The backstop is not some kind of terrible thing that's forcing the British government to do something horrible to Northern Ireland. It is simply keeping the border open so that people in Northern Ireland get the benefit of that and are able to trade in and out of Europe without a border. The trouble is that the Unionists in Northern Ireland see this as a red rag to a bull. They cannot countenance anything different happening in Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK. And for some bizarre reason, the Democratic Unionist Party would rather disadvantage the entire electorate of Northern Ireland and force them into a situation where they can't trade properly across the border with their friends and relatives in the south, rather than accept what is essentially a cost-saving exercise for the UK, and what is essentially also a rescue package for the people of Northern Ireland so that they can keep trading. So this bizarre story that somehow the Brexit backstop was some horrible thing to be enforced on the UK against its will. In actual fact, the main reason why the UK doesn't like the backstop is because the DUP thinks that it will break their so-called precious union. They won't be able to call themselves British anymore because they'll be somewhere in the middle between Britain and the European Union. Well, what the hell does that matter? They're not going to be affected by that. The DUP could still operate as a party, they'd still be unionists. The precious union would still exist despite the fact that the border is open and despite the fact that the rules in Northern Ireland were slightly different. Well, the rules in Northern Ireland about a lot of things are slightly different. Abortion, for example, the rules are very different. Gay marriage, for example, the rules were very different. So if Northern Ireland has different rules for trade, well, what the hell's the problem with that? The real reason why the Conservative Party particularly doesn't like the backstop, it's not the backstop that's the problem. The backstop is being used as an excuse. The real reason the Conservatives could not swallow the whole idea of the European Union deal was the fact that because the backstop would be in place, and because, broadly speaking, the UK would have to continue to keep its trading systems largely in line with the European Union for an indefinite period if they didn't come to a trade deal. That also meant that the antitrust laws, these are the laws in the European Union which came into effect at the beginning of this year, which prevent companies and individuals in the European Union from hiding their money in low tax threshold and low taxation islands such as the British Virgin Islands, the Scilly Isles, the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man, anywhere where the British state has set up a tax haven, basically. That would have to stop. Now, because that law was brought in at the beginning of this year, 2019, meant that many very wealthy Tories, particularly people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, would be unable to hide the massive incomes that we're making from the British taxman. That's what this is about. They didn't want their money being taxed in the UK because they knew they would have to pay more taxes on it here. And this is the politicians we're talking about, by the way, and not just business people, but politicians themselves from the Tory party didn't want to have this money that they have hidden away in these low tax islands brought back to the UK and taxed. And that would have come into play on Brexit Day, because Brexit Day, remember, was the 29th of March originally, and of course that slid. And that again was a delaying tactic by the British government so that these rules wouldn't be brought in and brought to bear on the British government. And again, they are trying desperately to wriggle out of the European Union without a deal, because they know that if they don't come out without a deal, then they will have to keep the regulatory framework in place, including the antitrust legislation currently being enacted in the European Union. All of these things are to do with advantaging the wealthy, and particularly the wealthy Tory donors who bankroll both the government, they bankroll the Tory party, they bankroll the entire British media structure. So there are a lot of reasons why the British government, particularly the Tory government, wants a no-deal Brexit. And the pretense that somehow or other it's the European Union's fault is false, because the European Union has said repeatedly that they have negotiated a deal with the Prime Minister in good faith. It was all signed, and it's the British politicians who are standing in the way of it. The backstop is not the serious impediment that it's being made out to be. The only reason it's an impediment at all is because of the Democratic Unionist Party and because of the tax evasion of Britain's wealthy. If you take those two things away, the backstop has literally no effect on the United Kingdom at all, other than altering the way that trade is done in the island of Ireland. So if we want to avoid a no-deal Brexit, and I think it's almost inevitable there will be one, then there would need to be a general election, and that would mean there must be no confidence vote, and it must succeed. Boris Johnson must resign, and the earliest possible date that there could be any kind of British general election would be the 24th, maybe the 25th of October. That's cutting it very, very fine. And a new government would have to be elected, and if it were a Labour government elected or a coalition, would they call a second ballot on the European Union? It could well be that the whole of Brexit gets called off at the very last second. It might not. If Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings carry out their threat of preventing any kind of action by the British Parliament to cause a general election, to preempt or to precipitate the general election, if they can stop it and hold it back until after Brexit, then it's almost inevitable that there will be a no deal, because if the British government expects the European Union to blink on this, they're wrong. The European Union doesn't have anything to lose by just staying completely quiet. and not saying a word. It is the British who believe that they're in a negotiation. It's the British government that is characterising this as some kind of bluff, that the European Union is actually just playing a hand of poker here. But I think the bluff will be called, because 27 countries are not going to take the massive hit that a no-deal Brexit will deliver to the British economy. They'll take a tiny 27th of that hit. It'll be a very much smaller effect on the rest of Europe than it will be on the UK. And particularly on Scotland. Scotland's economy will be virtually wiped out by a no-deal Brexit, because the costs of exporting anywhere would be huge, and not to mention the chaos of having to completely renegotiate 70 or 100 trade deals in as few years as possible so that we can start to export again. The whisky industry would be hit. The shipbuilding industry would be hit. Virtually everything that we export, food, would be hit. Even electricity, oil, gas, everything would be affected. The pound is plunging as it is at the moment. A no-deal Brexit will see it drop further. The Bank of England projects that if there's a no-deal Brexit, the pound will lose a further 25% of its value. And if you do the maths on that based on its current value, that would price the pound as being worth about 94 American cents, and probably well below a euro. And that is a catastrophe for the whole UK economy if that happens. So who's bluffing here, do you think? I don't think it's the European Union, because they don't have to bluff. In fact, they hold the high ground here. They've already negotiated a deal in good faith. They presented it to the UK. It's the best deal that they could put together, given the massive constraints that the British government put on that deal. All the red lines that mustn't be crossed. There was only one deal that was ever possible, and it was either that one or it was no deal. So the fact is, if they reject the deal that the European Union has negotiated with Theresa May, then there's nothing left to talk about, and that's the only reason why the European Union isn't saying anything at the moment. And that leaves Scotland in this position of teetering on the brink as well, because if no deal can't be stopped, and if there's no way that Boris Johnson can be forced into an early general election, then the chances are very good that there will be no deal by the 31st. And do you think that they will negotiate another delay after Boris Johnson has pinned his entire premiership on getting this job done, anyway, anyhow, regardless of the cost to the country? He's putting the interests of the super rich, the tax avoiders of the United Kingdom, ahead of the well-being and it's hard to put this into words, but he's basically throwing the entire nation under the bus to protect the wealthy and to protect the bigots who run or think they run the Northern Ireland 6 counties at the moment. The UK is actually on the verge of exploding. I don't mean physically exploding, but the 4 nations that make up these islands, Ireland, Wales, Scotland and England, are on the brink of tearing themselves to pieces. England is really, when you look at it demographically, the only place that has any kind of majority for leaving the European Union. Even Wales now is beginning to backpedal and have second thoughts about this whole thing. And with the independence movement in Wales growing, and the cries for a border poll in Northern Ireland growing louder by the day, and Scotland now with over 52% of people wanting independence, it is only a matter of time before something gives. In Scotland at 7 the other night, I interviewed Angus Brendan McNeill, MP, about his amendment to the referendum. What would you call it? Referendum legislation, which is being debated or will be debated at the SNP conference in the autumn. And he wanted to put in an amendment which basically said that if all else fails and we can't get a Section 30 order, that we can use any British election, be it Holyrood or a general election at Westminster, as a plebiscite, as a way of voting for independence, to settle this matter once and for all before Brexit happens, that we have a chance to say whether we want to go with England into Brexit land and, you know, to threaten our industries in this way, or whether we want to take a different path. and decide for ourselves how we relate to the European Union as an independent country. I think that Brendan has the right idea. We need to have as many options as possible. It would be very foolish for the SNP at the moment to write off any option at all. You want to have as many plans as possible. And this would give us a plan A, B and C. We would have referendum with Section 30 order, or election. Or possibly a Holyrood election. But that again would have to wait for the cycle of government to turn again. And the next available time that we could vote in the general election in Scotland would be in 2021. Nicola's already said she wants an independence referendum with a Section 30 order by the end of next year, by the end of 2020. I actually think that's probably going to be a bit too late for what's happening at the moment. And having Brendan's and Chris McElhinney's idea already agreed at the SNP conference as a policy would give us another two strings to the bow. I will be interviewing Chris McElhinney, who is SNP councillor in Inverclyde, and I'm hoping to be interviewing him on Thursday night on Scotland at 7, and I'm hoping, I've invited Chris into the studio for face-to-face to go into more detail about what this idea of using an election means and how it would work, how the seats would count, and as far as I can understand it from Angus MacNeil, the idea would be to say that if Scotland wins a majority of Westminster seats for the SNP, for the Independence Party if you like, then that would be a mandate to end the Union. Basically to say that's it, it's suspended, it's over, it's time to negotiate the separation and the end of the current 300-year-old treaties of union, and to agree a new trading and political relationship with England and with Wales and Northern Ireland as well, but to come up with a new deal that satisfies us and gives us the opportunity to decide whether or not we wish to leave the European Union, and if we do, if we did want to leave the European Union, what we would replace the full membership with, and that would require another referendum after Scotland is independent. However, we'll be talking more with Councillor McElhinney, with Trish, about this, I hope, on Thursday evening. Just a little aside, I'll also be having a meeting tomorrow with Dr. Mark McNaught. He is the constitutional academic from France who has written the full new Scottish Constitution, and he's done this as a 5-year masterwork as a political lawyer. Essentially, he has written an entire constitution for Scotland. As soon as it votes for independence, it will have the basic legislative framework to create its constitution. Mark's done all the homework on this. It would be down to the Scottish Parliament to decide on the details that would fit into the framework. But having a written constitution for the new Scottish state would avoid the nonsense that we have to put up with in the UK at the moment, which is a state with no constitution. And yet it's a state with no constitution that thinks it can tell Scotland, which is a state which does have constitutional documents, that we are not a country and that we can't run our own affairs. There was an article published today, I believe, by a retired professor, Baird, I think his name is, I'll need to check, and in this he was exploring the United Nations view of what Scotland is at the moment. And his opinion is that under the terms of the United Nations, Scotland would be described not as a country, not as a nation, but as a colony of England, a colony which is being exploited by England, and a colony which is being settled by English people as a way of trying to subdue it and turn it into an extension of the English state. Now, I know that this is a very contentious issue, and there are always people who will raise the racism word when you start talking about people settling in Scotland. But the fact of the matter is, and you can look this up, that in the past few decades, over 1.5 million people from England and Wales have come north and settled in Scotland and become Scots. Whether that means that would dilute the vote for independence is a completely different question. Most of the English people I know who've settled in Scotland are in favour of independence, and I don't think, if it were ever policy for England to try to to have a mass immigration into Scotland to stymie independence, then I honestly don't think that is the case. I think what has happened is people have attracted to Scotland because they like it. And they like it because of what it is. And when they do move here, they don't want that to change. In other words, they don't want Scotland to be turned into what England is becoming at the moment. That's why they leave England and move here. So I think that racism card, people accuse anyone who says that there are a lot of settlers coming from England to Scotland, is branded as a racist. But the fact of the matter is a lot of people do settle in Scotland, and they do that because they like it here and they like Scots, they like the way of life. That doesn't make them settlers in the sense that you would say settlements on the West Bank of, or in terms of the Palestinian question. It's not the same thing, okay? But one thing is true, the United Nations description of an exploitation colony fits Scotland perfectly. Our raw materials, our natural resources, our oil, our gas, our stone, our water, our whisky, and a large amount of timber and land have all been appropriated by companies from England or by the English government itself. I'm moving. Hang on a second.